All right, we are live. Hey guys, welcome back to the Lou Perez podcast. I'm your host, Lou Perez, and my apologies for the way I sound right now. I don't know if this is allergies or if I have a cold or maybe something worse, which we might talk about on this show. I'm so happy, so delighted to bring to you two gentlemen working on a project that I think is so important. I'm going to bring them into the stream right now. First, I want to introduce you to Hawk Jensen. He is the director and one of the producers for the documentary Follow the Science, Lockdowns Go Viral. And we are also joined with the narrator, Clifton Duncan. So, guys, thank you so much for joining me live on a Tuesday night, and my apologies to you also for sounding like this. Clifton is a theater guy. He's a wonderful singer, performer. So I feel like I have no right to even be speaking with this nasally voice in your presence. So my apologies, sir.
Well, we can't hear the nasalness. We do have some extra chest resonance though, which is good.
Ooh, okay. Well, I've never heard that before. That sounds cool.
You also could just scream until you go hoarse and kind of pull a Demi Moore. That's always very popular.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah, you're taking me back to my my youth with
Well, G.I. Jane 2 was sort of like in the news cycle about a year ago, kind of brought it back, but yeah, good times. But thanks for having us here, and it's appreciate it. Thanks for it's nice to. I mean, we should also mention that you did a little bit of writing on Follow the Science.
I wanted to, if there was any way for me I wanted to take as much credit for this amazing documentary that you put together. So part of it is that there were, maybe you could talk a little bit about the Sound Minds Collective. I don't know how.
Sure.
How you put it.
In terms of the origin of this, well, so 2 years ago. So I mean, we just recently celebrated the 3-year anniversary of the pandemic, give or take, around March, April, and 2 years ago, right around the March, April time of 2021, I was approached by a number of filmmakers in the Hollywood scene who felt that these here pandemics and the COVID-19 craze didn't really add up. Our reasonable sense didn't really add up for there, and our artistic spidey sense, it didn't add up. And so we had a discussion, and they said, we'd really like to do a film. We're storytellers, and we feel there's a story to be told here in terms of there was an alternative way of thinking during the pandemic. And so they asked me to direct it. And but we were concerned about cancel culture. I mean, if people recall, it felt like if you said anything, like they would come for you. They'd come for your work, your livelihood, your ability to put food on the table. And if you had children, that's a big deal. And if you're, a starving artist, kind of, I've passed the starving artist phase, but if you're still just trying to make things happen, you really could feel that, your ability to work was under threat. So we formed a group called the Sound Mind Creative Group. We made it a mouthful on purpose. And we felt that it was a good opportunity for people to work of all stripes across all the different Hollywood grade industries, feature film, television, on down to the YouTuber world. That way people could work with us without fear of retribution and losing their typical clientele within the business. So the Sound Mind Creative Group was formed. I eventually went public because I tend to be a dissident filmmaker anyway, and felt that I could better lead out in public. But we're all very highly talented folks, and it was an incredible group that came together and ended up being a worldwide network. We worked with people in South Africa and the Philippines and all over the United States, Canada, and it really came together to make a high quality project that is called. We decided to sail right into the controversy and named it Follow the Science. We decided to do that. We decided to do that early because at the time it was the ad nauseum talking point for so many of the politicians, saying follow the science, and all of us could hear it. They weren't meaning it what the words typically would mean. There was some sort of double speak going on there in an Orwellian sense. Follow the science, comply, follow the narrative, do what you're told. There was a sense that there was something wrong there. So per that conversation I had, 2 years later, we worked on it and worked on it. It was supposed to be originally just one documentary, expanded into a whole docu-series. And what we just released, we actually had the worldwide premiere in Orlando, Florida on April 19th. And we're looking towards a wide public release online come June, was the pilot episode, the first episode, episode 1, which is subtitled Lockdowns Go Viral. So the whole series is called Follow the Science. And that ended up being 2 hours long. And we're probably going to produce an additional 5 to 7 hours of material across another basically 7 to 10 episodes, all about a half hour to 45 minutes each, looking at all the topics. And go ahead.
Oh, it's going to keep going until President Biden declares the documentary finished.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. Haphazardly off the cuff at some convention where no one was ready for him to make that decree. I'm sure it'll be something very similar to that. Yeah. But yeah, so it's been an incredible journey. I'm Clifton will probably make a few jokes about this. I'm a more relaxed person. I've been working on nothing but this film for the last 2 years, and to have finally shown it to our original sort of support base in Orlando was really thrilling, really exciting. It's a serious topic, and we really get into it, and there's some very serious aspects, but we wanted to make sure you had the full emotional experience. And so there's a lot of humor in it as well, a wry sense of humor. And that really opens people, because if you give them all the emotions, then they can really maybe perhaps think, change their mind. We have a whole kind of we have a whole story arc of an epiphany of what it is to change your mind during something like a pandemic. But the point being, bringing it all the way back to, you came in and as one of our punch-up writers, we're like, oh, we need some little more humor on this, and you had some pretty good lines that you wrote up for us, which then the wry sense of humor to Clifton Duncan absolutely nailed. I was neat to see that happen. Yeah.
Oh, well, no, that's great to hear. And yeah, and from what I've seen of the doc, Clifton, you really perfect casting, but not only in performance, but I think biographically too. Could you like sort of bring everyone up to speed on sort of like how you got involved in the controversy of, well, this project and, you know, COVID in general?
Yeah, well, it was all an accident, and you know, I was in New York, and I was an up and coming actor. I was beginning to distinguish myself as a singing actor, actually, in New York, which is a very big market, a hard thing to do in that market. And you know, I was breaking into television, so things were going very well. And then the world shut down in 2020. And at first, it's kind of funny because I was following the science, but in the ironic sense that we mean it for this documentary. And, you know, I was one of the few people in the city who was masking and gloving. It was like me and some middle-aged Dominican women on the train, you know, originally. And but over time, you know, a few things happened for me. One was, you know, things really didn't seem to make sense. You know, I remember our numbers were kind of going down, and, you know, I saw some weird kind of reporting happening, and I began to become alarmed about how the psychology of the city formerly known as New York was changing. And then there was I just had this sort of bleeding heart artist sensitive epiphany of, you know, everything that we're being asked to do to mitigate the spread of this virus seems to be completely antithetical to living any sort of joyful, rich, fulfilling life. You know, we're covering our faces. We're being told to isolate and stay away from each other. I mean, in New York, the gyms were closed, but the liquor stores were still open, which I thought was really interesting. And side note, I spoke to someone recently who said that you know, churches were closed, but AA meetings were considered non-essential while the liquor stores were still open. I thought that was very, very evil. Then I fled to Atlanta, Georgia, and it was like night and day, where as in Central Park, you had people that were masking outside, double masking, triple masking, all, you know, wearing all kinds of weird spacesuits. In Atlanta, you know, at Piedmont Park in Atlanta, people were, you know, they're having barbecues and playing cards and sharing beers and other kinds of substances, which I won't mention for your listeners. And, you know, the gyms were open. They were mask optional. It was really much closer to normal than in New York. And, you know, at the same time, the unrest from 2020 was kind of popping off. And I met some of the right people. They put me on their shows. I became very outspoken about what was happening then, but also just like saying, you know, against lockdowns and all the other COVID mitigation measures. I said, you know, we can't do this forever. And it became obvious to me, you know, the consequences of closing schools down, the consequences of, or the economic ramifications of locking down And even then, the ignorance of or dismissal of immunity provided by previous infection. So there are all these things that were bubbling up. And then in the entertainment industry, early 2021 thereabouts, they began to mandate the vaccines. And it was very strange because there was never any question from our unions, for instance. You'd get these emails and surveys, and they would just presume that everyone was going to take this vaccine. And for me, I recovered from COVID in late 2020. So by that point, I was like, well, why would I need to get a quote unquote vaccine for something that I've already recovered from? It doesn't make any sense to me. And but of course, if you said any of that, you were a granny killer, a far right anti-vaxxer. It's like, oh, really? Go to the gym and take your vitamins. Wow, what a far right concept. But nobody else in the industry, was really speaking up about it. And just over time, it was kind of strange. I just began building this following by saying what I really think about these things. And it turns out a lot of people agree with me. And I guess I got put on the radar of Sound Mind Creative Group, and they reached out to me and said, we're doing this documentary, and we do want to be a part of it. I read it. I liked the approach. I thought it was very accessible, very sort of, I guess I'll say family friendly. And they really took a methodical approach to applying the scientific method in a way that I think was very clearly communicated. And you kind of come to the conclusion that this method wasn't really followed in terms of imposing all these measures. And, having seen the documentary now, just now seen it, boy, I got to tell you, it really does pack a punch. And they really get into the nitty gritty and the details, and they don't get bogged down. There's a lot of information, but it's communicated very clearly and highly effectively, and in a very exciting and dynamic way. And the crescendo that it builds to, the emotional climax that it builds to, I think really serves to highlight the extreme amount of damage that's been done. And what I've done in the film, at least, my sort of journey, is coming in a very sort of confident way, saying, well, lockdown, we have to lock down or do nothing. And my mind changes over time, and it's very clearly communicated, and it's just a very powerful film.
I remember early on when I think Hawk, you guys were just like interviewing so many people, like from so many different like walks of life. And I remember I sat down and talked to you guys, and it was the first time that I had ever sort of looked back, sort of, month by month of the journey that I went through during COVID. And I think the subject matter is interesting for multiple reasons. But one of those reasons is because everybody went through it in some capacity, whether it's the people who, unfortunately, not like, Clifton and me, who were able to get out of the city. You have those people who were stuck in the cities. You have the people who were able to, breathe freely in Atlanta. For me, it was driving out around 45 minutes to an hour to New Jersey and like going to the beach and like, oh my God, I'm in normal country now compared to where I was. So no matter where you were on it, whether you were paranoid, whether you were skeptic, whether you were, totally freaked out or totally, in a very odd, blissful state of the world being at a stagnated, we all live through it. And when it comes to, presenting that, like, how do you go about presenting, like a major event that's really ongoing, how do you go about telling that story?
Yeah, well, it's something we had to think about quite a bit. I mean, it was we sat down and was like, my God, this thing's huge. I mean, to your point, this was the first true worldwide experience. I mean, I said this throughout my entire sort of fundraising phase and development phase and scripting phase and production and post-production, was that everywhere you've ever been and everyone you've ever met also had to deal with the lockdowns. I mean, tangentially COVID-19, but that 1-2 punch of this new virus and and this draconian measure of lockdowns that came up, that became a word that we all heard, and suddenly we were following it. I mean, this idea of flattening the curve and not overwhelming the hospitals. I mean, there were all these discrete moments that sort of introduced it, but at a certain moment, but then that a concept was introduced, and all of our lives changed forever. And we knew that we needed to capture this real time. I mean, right now, here we are about to come out with it, and we see this sea change where people are already trying to like back off from what they said at the time, and the retrospective, or the revisionist history starting. And that was specifically what we wanted to push back against. We wanted to make, someone actually said, oh, you're making a retrospective, like hindsight must be 2020. It's like, no. We made it during the pandemic.
Right.
We are capturing the history real time. We could feel and see the cogs of history turning all around us. And so we wanted to capture that. And we also understood that the nature of everything that was happening was so fast, was so rapid paced. Things kept happening. It was about every 2 to 3 weeks there'd be some new. It was like a bad like a sci-fi show where it's like, oh, we need the dilithium crystals this week, and oh, we need this. What's the particle of the week that we need? It was sort of this constant influx of things to be terrified of, or at least to dominate your frontal lobe, your frontal psyche, so you could only think about that. You couldn't think about anything else. And then once that was used up, it was dropped, never to be spoken of again, and moved on to the next sort of ginned up fear for the population to worry about. And I'm going to be a little more aggressive with my language now that the film's done, because I've been very diplomatic about it. But it's been, now that people can see it much more clearly, it's been pretty awful, this sort of nonstop narrative designed to not let you think about anything else. And what we get into in the show, I mean, the pilot itself, what we did was we looked very specifically at about January 2020 to about October 2020. We wanted to look at that whole development of what we all experienced. I mean, Clifton mentioned the scientific method, but we tried to really think through the hero's journey in the sort of the Hollywood feature film parlance, and the scientific journey, and try and weave a story that brings both that sort of knowledge base as well as the emotional base. I mean, when you go on an emotional journey, when you go on the hero's journey, you're going on a series of emotional arcs and thresholds, and we wanted to sort of bring those together and see if we could go back and decipher what we experienced, as well as talk to people real time. Like, we were asking people, what was the first time you heard of COVID? What was the first time you realized that this thing called COVID and lockdowns was going to affect your life, like for real? Like, oh, I have to deal with this, and things I'm used to are going away. And then the process of accepting that, and then the process of trying to understand what's going on around you, and like, oh, well, it's for the good of the country. I mean, this idea of not overwhelming the hospitals. Well, okay, flattening the curve. Oh, okay. Well, it's kind of like rolling up your sleeve and giving blood in the aftermath of some horrible U.S. catastrophe, which was a very part of like the American way, sensibility. And so everyone's like, oh, okay. And it didn't. And then this mission drift started, and there was like, well, we have to get the cases down. And there was never a true explanation. There was never a moment where it felt like there was a proper, rational conversation. And then it was all mixed up in the weird political division that we've been experiencing these last few years. So like the average American could not figure out what was going on, and was basically allowed to just let their fear dominate. And we just wanted to methodically go through, be very thorough. This happened, and then this happened, and this happened. And then understanding it specifically from a couple different perspectives. We have two heavyweights in terms of the scientific perspective. One is Dr. Jay Bhattacharya, a renowned public health and infectious disease scientist and professor out of Stanford, as well as Dr. David Katz, who's a renowned chronic disease specialist who hailed originally out of Yale. And between the two of them, they actually give a really good understanding of what the scientific community was understanding was going on. They too were kind of confused by the narrative, because they started to look at it as scientists and looking at it like, well, what are we going to do? And bringing in different information from different places. And they started to feel this on high voice saying, you must not do the science, you must do what you're told. Well, who is this? Oh, well, that's Science Inc. That's the scientists on high. That's the public policy people telling you what to do, and ostensibly embodied in Dr. Fauci, giving and coming after them not as scientists or challenging their arguments, but going after them in a type of propaganda attack that they had never before seen. And so Dr. David Katz and Bhattacharya have this sort of slow realization over the course of it. It's like, yeah, it was. We knew there were problems with the profession of science, being a scientist, and like, there's always a little bit of corruption, but they started to really see that there was a big disconnect between what science is supposed to be and what science was being presented. So we have that perspective, and over that time period, and then we have sort of Clifton kind of representing the everyman character, who sort of walks us through the process of seeing it from the human interest level, like the devastation that people are experiencing at a human level, and trying to understand it. But Clifton sort of has all these questions. He's the curious human trying to figure out what's going on. And we bring in this other character, Nick Hudson, who is the chairman of this group called Pandata, a South African group of basically dissident scientists that started to step up and push back and advised on the film. They start looking at it from like a basic understanding, like the science communication level, like understanding what Dr. Bhattacharya and Dr. Katz are talking about it, and digesting it, as well as Clifton's understanding of what we were told by Science Inc. at the time. So they start to kind of decode that. And then finally, we have a third perspective, sort of the mainstream narrative perspective, from this really great investigative journalist named Sydney Watson, who's found great popularity as a YouTuber. And she has a conversation. She sort of reports the COVID news now, kind of looking at it real time, what was going on, so we could sort of track the archival footage. But then she also has a conversation with this wonderful woman named Jen Reisman, a child psychologist who was very much COVIDian and sort of a mask enforcer and all this stuff, doing what she was told. Like, if we don't do what we're told, there's going to be bodies in the street. If you're not complying, why are you killing my child? She was very much in that world, and yet she worked with children and could see over time the severe damages of lockdowns and what that was doing. And she was starting to have that cognitive dissonance of like, wait, I believe this, but I see this. What am I supposed to do? And at a certain point, she clicks over and realizes that perhaps this isn't the best course of action. Perhaps she should start questioning it. And she went through the process of changing her mind. So obviously we've made this very complex story with all these storylines, interweaving these. So we have three perspectives to try and help people understand what they just went through. If you want to navigate, you need 3 points of reference. So we have these three perspectives to try and help us as a people get grounded in our own culture as to what just happened. So that's sort of the fabric of what we've created and have been working on so hard these last 2 years.
Yeah, and Clifton, from something that you mentioned, earlier, it's sort of being asked to not to do all these things that bring us joy, and that's something that I found was just this cloud of joylessness that fell over every my community and everywhere that I was, and I'm just wondering, from your perspective, what the hell was that about? Because something that I like throughout the whole thing, and I my first son was born on March 26th, 2020, so right at the height, we didn't know what was going on. And I was paranoid for the next, few months. But anytime that some good news came along, I was really happy to hear good news. I was really happy to learn, oh, it doesn't affect babies really. You don't have to worry about that. It's like, great, I got one of those. I don't have to worry about my son getting sick. Fantastic. But it seemed like there were just just so many people that no good news was good. It was, and maybe you could, I don't know.
Yeah, it's funny you say that, because I actually have a former friend who, we were talking about all the stuff that was going on, and I actually, I was sending her articles, I think one was the Johnny Anitas Wall Street Journal op-ed, where he found that, it's probably not as bad as we're being told. Another one was about natural immunity, the studies that were being done, the data that was coming out as far as the strength and robustness of natural immunity. And she literally texted me. She said, I don't want any good news right now, because of racial justice, basically. And at that point, what do you do with these people? It was so shocking to me to watch people just completely abandon any sense of what gives life meaning. They were willing to abandon it for a protracted period of time, for an indefinite period. Some people are still doing it today. And, I lost a lot of respect for people, particularly in the performing arts community in New York, the arts community. And, people have pushed back on me about this before, but, you know, when you think of New York City, what's one of the first things that you think of? It's Broadway. You know, people come from all over the world to be in these shows, to see these shows. We have some of the best museums in the world, some of the best arts institutions in the world. And they all shut down and they all refused to open. And I said to myself, well, are you telling me that you on Broadway are less essential than liquor stores and weed dispensaries? It's really, you know, but people were so they were so paralyzed with fright. And on top of that, you're talking about New Yorkers, right? I mean, New Yorkers, they pride themselves on being, you know, smarter than everybody else, being these intellectuals. They pride themselves on being tough, and they exhibited none of those qualities whatsoever throughout the course of, especially throughout 2020, and again, still to this day, even now. And I just want to go back a little bit because, you know, on what Hawk said about people now that they're trying to revise, you know, history. One of the most effective things that the documentary does is that it actually is sort of the first act is a sort of real-time recreation. It kind of takes you back, it plunges you back into the panic and the fear that was stoked at that time. As a matter of fact, the person I was sitting next to during the screening, she said it was hard for her to watch because she felt like she was reliving it all over again. And that level of terror, you know, it's really quite shameful. You know, that's why I can't call him Dr. Fauci anymore, because real doctors actually help people. And, you know, these people, I don't know if people will ever recover from this. And I think another aspect to it as well, especially in Blue America, AKA the Blue cult, you know, you have these, it became really partisan for a very strange reason. I think a lot of this came, a lot of the reaction to it, particularly in Blue America, became about ousting Donald Trump from office, which is ridiculous. And you know, this is why they clung to, and you could see their contradictions in some of their policy decisions. For instance, the vaccine mandates. And I'd make this point over and over and over again. This is an industry you have to understand. The entertainment industry, in the wake of the death of George Floyd, they went full on anti-racist. I mean, like Ibram X. Kendi, Robin DiAngelo, anti-racist. And their whole thing was basically coddling Black people and telling them that they're going to be okay, and just trying to include them in everything. And yet, at the same time, a year later, they imposed these vaccine mandates. Well, guess what, guys? Black Americans are the least vaccinated demographic, followed by Latinos, and they don't care about any of that. But in their minds, it's a bunch of, you know, MAGA hat wearing chuds, I guess, that are the only people who are refusing the vaccine. It's like, wait a minute, guys, Black people vote over 90% Democrat. Like the math just doesn't add up. And, you know, or bodily autonomy is another one. I mean, literally every principle that these, you know, progressive New Yorkers, these progressive artists or whatever claim to stand by, claim to hold, they violated each and every one of them. And that's something that you can't really unsee. And for my money, you know, I don't think I'll ever trust these people again, to be honest with you.
Well, I think it's really tough too to have a reckoning, or I don't know, nationwide or worldwide forgiveness for a number of reasons. One, it's the people who were wrong do not want to admit that they were wrong, or or they're like, well, you know, at the time, you know, science evolves and blah blah, you know, and all that. And then on the other hand, you have the people who were wronged by those who were quote unquote right. I myself, I mean, I can't tell you how many times in Brooklyn, I lived in Brooklyn Heights, how many times I would be out with my wife and our baby in a stroller, walking around our neighborhood without a mask on, and people would stop and like basically try to start a fight with me for not having my mask on. And it's like, you know, asking me to forgive those people, that's a really, really tough ask. I mean, we often hear about, you know, this potential civil war, you know, and I mean, basically that's where I saw the Civil War lines. It's like, mask holes with masks on.
Well,
You know,
if I can jump in,
yeah,
I'm laughing because I heard Brooklyn. It was really bad in Brooklyn. I have a few friends who are out there. They were like, these people are in Prospect Park are freaking insane.
yeah.
But I mean, bad enough as that was, and people again they got mad at me. But I did a tweet where I don't know if you know who Suraj Hashmi is, but he put me on. He has this thing on Twitter where he has a list every week of people
Oh,
who should
yeah,
have
yeah,
their
yeah.
phones taken away, and he put me on the list for this tweet. But I stand by it. I said unvaccinated is the new nigger. And people clap back and they're like, well, it's a choice and yada yada yada. I was like, that's not the point. The point is the metaphor, because that is how you're treating these people. You have people like Noam Chomsky saying that you should be put in, essentially isolated from society, and if you starve, you starve. You have people like George Takei talking about how you should be denied, and Jimmy Kimmel saying you should be denied medical care. Don Lemon, may his career rest in peace, talking about well, if you don't you don't get the vaccine, you can't go to church, you can't go to work. Don't get the vaccine, you can't basically go outside. So you have people who, in addition to wanting to attack you for not wanting to wear a mask, especially outside, it's like, come on guys, what that about? You had people who really saw no problem with creating a lower caste of society, with creating a two-tiered society where they just said these unmentionables, these untouchables should be shunted, hidden into a basement somewhere and treated, like again, like niggers in the 30s. That's I stand by that comparison, and that's Go ahead, Hawk.
Well,
I was going to say,
I was just saying, because I remember seeing all those pamphlets around that, the unvaccinated are trying to take our white women. And,
Sorry, but no, it's like, you can't come in this restaurant. You can't come in, in this museum. You can't go to school. I mean, it was unbelievable.
Do you have your papers? You can be stopped and asked for your papers, and you can't enter anywhere in Manhattan unless you have your papers. I mean, there were so many old world controlling mechanisms that came into play. It was shocking. And I think your observations are very astute, Clifton, as always. And I mean, but the fact that shaming and shunning became the norm. I mean, I thought those were old world things that, went away 2 centuries ago in terms of, beyond the the catty girls at high school, and yet suddenly it was a thing. I remember in the early days when I was in Santa Barbara at the time, and it was that first couple of weeks of the Flatten the Curve, and people were like, well, the one thing you can do is you can go out for a run. Like everything, the beaches are closed because someone very famously, the cops actually busted a guy in a kayak in Santa Barbara. That was one of those national news things. But you could go up in the hills and you could go for a run. And I recognized it for what it was from the beginning. I'll just say that I refused to wear a mask. I was like, this is just one giant practice of compliance. That this is coming from a certain space, and I'll explain why I felt that way in a minute. But I just remember when I was running up the hill, and people would see me coming without a mask, and they would like, here comes an unmasked person, unclean. And they would stop and they would turn their backs. Say there was like a group of 5 of them, and they would turn their backs on the trail. So I had to run along their backs, because that was because that turn was going to save them from whatever it is. They felt some particulates in the air from me breathing momentarily outdoors with them with the broad daylight. But that turning of the shoulder, that'll fix me and help them. And I remember being like, oh wow, this is real old world stuff coming bubbling back up. But I mean, I've the reason I do the moniker of a dissident filmmaker was I started making films about sort of looking at communism from the Soviet era and current socialist regimes as to what exactly happened there that led to the deaths of hundreds of millions and is verboten to speak about in Hollywood. Why can't you talk about that? Like, who says, why is that a thing? And I just can't help it. I'm such a natural contrarian. I went into it, and I spent the last 7 years doing this show called The Witness Project, in which I interviewed dissidents, people who stood up in the face of this type of oppression, either to jump the wall in like Berlin or drag themselves 6,000 miles out of North Korea to get around to South Korea on crutches. I mean, these incredible people, individuals who made choices one foot in front of another to get out of there. And so I learned a lot about what it is to be a oppressed person in an authoritarian society that uses fear and a bunch of thugs to keep you under control. And they kind of warned me, well, here are the signs. This is what it looks for. This is kind of how the government acts and how you start to feel, because they're trying to collapse your individuality internally. And the second this thing called COVID-19 came along, or the SARS-CoV SARS-CoV-2, and it wasn't this sort of immediate sort of, hey, everyone, we're going to calm down, we're going to figure this out, we'll get through it together. Let's get the American sort of entrepreneurial or resilience kind of in play, and let's get everyone working on it, and we'll get the Manhattan Project or the Camp David, bringing all the best minds. It just became this sort of on high sort of dear leader coming from the health policy folks, the public health policy folks, telling everyone, this is what's going on. We're in control. Do what you're told. Don't ask questions. And I thought, my God, this is it. This is sort of like, this is the big attempt from government to get into our lives and rip out our individuality, our ability to make decisions for ourselves. And they're going to use every trick in the book and to pit us against each other. And it just felt like, I mean, just everything we've just described humorously was there, you know, because that's us seeing it like, wow, they're really trying to pit everyone against each other. And because it split everyone right down the middle, families, church groups, theater groups, political groups. You couldn't decide, you couldn't guess who was going to kind of fall for it and those who would become skeptical of it. And it was a fascinating thing to watch, but it really put my ire on high alert. And, you know, I couldn't do it. I'm a storyteller. So I fought back by making this project and, you know, started and made great friends and allies. And those who also was like, wait, this doesn't make any sense. And there's been sort of a grand awakening of a new individual who sees this for what it is, which I think is a great thing. And I'm optimistic about it, but it's hard. It's hard to know how are we going to forgive and forget these people who really wanted us to die because we felt differently than complying with what they so almost like lemmings ran into being told what to do. It was just a shocking thing to behold.
Yeah, I the one thing you would see a lot is like, oh, you just want to go get your hair cut. You know, like you want grandmothers to die because you want to get a haircut. But meanwhile, those same people were allowing grandmothers to die alone.
Right. Yeah,
right.
Amazing.
So even like recently, I saw somebody on Twitter make the haircut thing. It's like, oh, well, that's what you might remember, but I remember like attending a memorial service for my friend's mother who died, and we had to do it all via Zoom. You know, so I'm like in my car with my wife, with her phone. You know, basically, you know. Watching my friend give a eulogy for his mother because we couldn't be together for that. Like, I remember that shit, you know,
and everything that they believe. I mean, it literally is either backwards or it's just projection. I mean, you know, they make these flippant remarks about, oh, you just want to get a haircut. Meanwhile, Lori Lightfoot and Nancy Pelosi and Gretchen Whitmer are going to the salon. And Gavin Newsom is going out, hanging out with his buddies, maskless at the French Laundry. Nobody cares about these people. Or with, you know, Ron DeSantis was accused over and over again of cooking the books and hiding the bodies. That's why their numbers were so low in Florida. Meanwhile, our disgraced former governor of New York, Andrew Cuomo, literally is fudging the numbers. His own attorney general released a 75-page report that revealed that's exactly what he was doing, and he was hiding the body, you know, metaphorically speaking, fudging the numbers for political purposes. So again, I mean, their entire reality is just inside out, and yet they came. You know, there's still people today who say, "Well, I hope you don't get put on a ventilator." It's like, dude, ventilators went out of style in 2020. Like, what are you talking about right now? They don't know anything, but they think they know everything because everything that they think they know comes from, you know, these authoritative sources, which have been spreading misinformation for the entirety of the pandemic. It's unbelievable.
I remember seeing a few things. One, talking about people who want you dead. Like when Joe Rogan said that he had COVID, like he really did his enemies a disservice by not only living but kicking it in like a weekend. You know, like there were people who wanted him to die because wouldn't that be amazing if you get, you know, if this guy who is willing to have you know, skeptics onto his podcast, you know, wouldn't it be amazing if he actually dropped dead from this? And they were so angry when it didn't happen. It really
the neuroses really took over. I mean, it's sort of just everyone. Zuby, you know, rapper, author, podcaster. He's a featured voice in the documentary, and you know, he makes one point that, like, I mean, when essential versus non-essential came along, and he was like, you know, any job that puts food on the table for your family is essential, period. You know, and you're talking about this sort of two-class system that was sort of created overnight. and you're saying like people cheering for the demise, death, or severe ailment to anyone who might be speaking up against it. Meanwhile, I mean, Jay Bhattacharya makes this wonderful point. I mean, sad, terrible point that seems to have eluded all of the carrying masses of the left. Hundreds of millions of people went into food insecurity almost overnight, which resulted in starving conditions for tens of millions of children, and hundreds of thousands of children indeed starved to death in the third world about this. They never even entered the narrative. These were people that were just basically thrown out in the trash, politically inconvenient, narratively inconvenient, and we just pretend they don't exist. And these are the people who felt they were doing the right thing. It's just they are so off base. It's just hard to. Yeah, I mean, Clifton always gets me with that one. It's like, how are we ever going to forgive? It's going to be a tough climb up that mountain. That said, and that's for me personally, but with Follow the Science, the show that we've created, what we did want to do and what we have done is we wanted to create a platform that allows for that conversation to happen. It was the dialogue that was lost. It was our ability to converse, to ask questions. And so that's why we have so many characters where we have a series of very in-depth conversations that demonstrates to people what conversations look and sound like, because that seems to be a dying art form. But also by the end, the main host, which is Clifton, Sydney Watson, and Nick Hudson, have a conversation, or they have a moment where they sort of share what they've learned and bring that to the table to understand it, because that was the type of conversation we never had. I mean, I think the only way we're going to get back to a unified people or some sort of unified American culture is through conversation and is through dialogue. And that's what we feel Follow the Science, Lockdowns Go Viral presents and begins that conversation. We want to do it over the arc of about 10 episodes and, establish the trust and admiration for Clifton and his fellow co-hosts. So like, here are the people that do it. But I do think that we're going to have a lot of conversations and learn and bring everyone's story to bear. I mean, everybody learned something from this. As we said at the beginning of this, everyone lived through this. Everyone has something to add. And if we establish people have value in that, rather than them projecting their fears, like they're so terrified to admit they're wrong, they'd rather project their fear, demonize us, and never listen to anyone. And we got to, I know some of them, some are irreconcilable. We can't get to them, but there's so many traditional liberals who have been sort of lost their voice to the hard left that I think we can probably reach a lot of people who would otherwise don't know what to say, but have their own inner suspicion as to what's been going on. And luckily, I think a lot of people are waking up, but we feel this series will help bring more people into the fold of sort of that moderate, curious human, reasonable, cultural zeitgeist that I think, can be civil, and I hope it will be in the future.
Yeah. And just so for those of you watching, I just lost my camera. I didn't leave the conversation at all. Something I want to talk about, because I don't know if I've been demonetized yet for this video, or it will be, but maybe we can get there. But talking about conversation and wanting to use the series to foster conversation, it was really tough to have a conversation when at least one side of it was censored. And I don't know if it was revealed in Twitter files 15 or 25, or I don't know where we are right now, but what did you guys make of, the revelations that, there was, blatant censorship of a lot of the ideas that are expressed in this documentary?
Well, yeah. Well, specifically, we get into the Great Barrington Declaration, which was Jay Bhattacharya and his colleagues' attempt to, ring the alarm bell and say, hey, we've got the wrong policy here. Let's try and get a conversation going and rectify this. And they had sort of almost a naive sense of like, oh, okay, this is us doing what good scientists do. And the scientists on high will listen to this and we'll redirect it. And yeah, and yet it turns out all the cliches are true, and everything we suspected was going on. And the corruption went all the way to the top, and it was deeper than anyone had at all realized. And it was what we suspected, but as it started coming out and kept coming out and kept coming out, that this had nothing to do with science, it had everything to do with posturing, politics, and money. That we were, it's an odd thing to be on the pulse of one of the worst things you could imagine happening. So it was good to see the revelations come out. It was good to get the confirmation, but we have a lot of work to do to try and disentangle ourselves from this mess that our public health policies put us into. Public policy health leaders put us into.
Clifton, I first came across you and your work through Twitter, which I think, I think a lot of people maybe they first encountered you there. Did you experience any of that stuff, any of that censorship, like, firsthand?
Not that I'm really aware of, honestly. But I also was, I was sort of a bit more crafty, and I won't say tactful, but in some ways I had my own bit of cowardice in a way, because I wouldn't touch too much on hot button issues, but I also am very much a smart ass. So the way that I approached things was that I really tried to highlight the absurdity of what was going on, and sort of make snide snide innuendos and these kinds of things. So I wasn't like, retweeting or big boosting, like Robert Malone or Peter McCullough all the time. But I'd make, I'd make some sort of subtle references to, like adverse events and vaccine enhanced, whatchamacallit, ADE. The acronym escapes me now, but I don't feel like I was really suppressed all that much, to be honest with you. But at the same time, I don't think I'm that important in the grand scheme of things. So, people could always, and I also did the Jon Stewart thing, where I could always just hide behind just a dumb actor. Like, what do you care? Of course, I'm not an expert. Why are you listening to me? Why would anyone listen to anything that I have to say? So I could always hide behind that as well. But I don't feel like I got censored that much. But it is interesting. I consider Jay a friend, and to see this guy who when you talk to him and when you meet him, he's like the warmest, one of the smartest, wise people you could ever meet. And the way that he has been maligned and his character's been assassinated, by these charlatans like Francis Collins and Anthony Fauci, is really unbelievable. And to think that I call it the reality cartel, big tech, they curate the information that we see, that they distort the reality that we experience. And to see that they and the government had a hand in suppressing that information, people really need to take a step back about the sort of structures that are in place that enable that sort of thing to happen. Because I think for me, one of the scariest, most frightening aspects of all of this is that, and I think I made a tweet about this, is that, whatever happens, even if things go back to normal tomorrow, the precedent has been set, and the powers that be, and you don't have to really assign any sort of grand conspiracy to it. It's just people who are in charge, at Google or at, formerly at Twitter, or in the government, they can do all this again, and they can manufacture a crisis. They can manufacture any message that they want to. They can propagandize the population to get them afraid of anything that they want, and they can censor you and control your ability to talk about it. And that's probably the most alarming thing for me right now.
Yeah. Well, one thing that I'm really interested in is just the litany of things that, the quote unquote experts got wrong. Like Clifton, something that you brought up was when it came time to decide on getting a vaccine, you said, well, I already had it, so I have natural immunity. And I remember it was a pretty high profile case, or a NBA player. I think it was Kyrie Irving, who was a young man. You think he's like 21 or 22. And so many people came down on him because he didn't want to get vaccinated. And the way that he explained it, he said, well, I've had it already, and I'm like 22, and I'm a professional athlete, in peak, he's in peak form. He's like, and I've decided that, whatever the risks are, I'd rather not take those risks. And the people who came after him, like, this guy's not a doctor, he's not a scientist, what an idiot, only to, to come back how, where we are today, where it's like, well, yeah, natural immunity. Yeah, it's, it's,
Well, I
it's
think
good.
another example is a basketball player named Jason Isaacs, who, he gave a very eloquent explanation of why he's decided not to, get the jab. And I remember there's this black, quote unquote, intellectual named Mark Lamont Hill, who did this
Mark Lamont.
snarky quote. Yeah, my favorite person. Did this snarky quote tweet, and it said, this, I guess this sounds smart, or this sounds something like, this sounds dumb to people who actually know things. Like, it was so snarky and snide.
Right.
And I was like, everything he said it is true. But on top of that, I'm not saying that this is the cause, but as I understand it, he got the jab, and then he suffered some heart issues.
Oh, wow.
Subsequently. So, I mean, I don't know if he feels the same way about it now, but Kyrie is kind of easy to dismiss because some of his other beliefs have kind of come out, and people have been like, oh wow, I don't know about that. But with
Yeah, I mean,
Jason
when he was like,
Isaacs,
he was like, I know the Jews want me to
really
put this.
well-spoken.
So, yeah, I don't know if there was any.
Yeah, I was like, I don't know about that, Kyrie.
Yeah. It's like, Kyrie, okay, you're the actual part of the tribe. Okay, I get it. Okay, let's just move on. No, it was wild. Well, something too. I know somebody who she was vaccinated, and she was very hesitant to put out there that after she got vaccinated, her menstrual cycle changed significantly. Right?
Yeah, a lot about that. Yeah,
and she's she's a Democrat. She also has like a pretty big audience. And when she put that info out, I think she sort of said, like, I'm not telling you not to get the vaccine. I don't want you to think that I'm saying that there's something wrong with the vaccine, blah, blah. I just want you to know that it's affected me in this way. And it's like, man, like, we were really at a point where people just couldn't be open and honest and be like, hey, like, I got vaccinated, right? Fortunately, I didn't even get sick. I was fine. Right. But I know other people who, man, they got really fucked up. It's like they had a terrible response to it. I want to know about that, just so just so I could be knowledgeable and educated on what's happening.
Well, it's sort of like people are absolutely resistant to being forced to critically think. I mean, I think critical thinking has been one of the great losses to humanity in the last 20 years. I think the internet came along, started thinking for people, if you will, and they lost the ability to critically think. And anything that forces them to actually possibly let the cog in their brain click forward once is terrifying to them, or some such thing. And it's like, no, I don't want to know. And if you're trying to tell me, I'm going after you, the messenger, because the messenger is wrong. And it's like this. I mean, and that's what I mean about like old world. I mean, it's just like the shaming and shunning. They do not want to face their own capacity to think, and they do not want to activate it, and they want to be told what to do, and they want to comply. And they're given the, saving grandma, saving everybody. They have this sort of this noble lie has been told them. And given we have, I mean, there was a virus, there were vulnerable people, the elderly and those with comorbidities. I mean, focused protection. That's all that Jay Bhattacharya was asking for. What we need to be doing is focusing protection on the elderly and those with comorbidities. They're the ones who are actually vulnerable. And what we don't want to do is lock down the entire society, because we know that has way worse effects. But that was what was suppressed. And to say anything differently, it was just a bizarre thing to watch. People in absolute denial. I mean, with the concept of mass formation coming along and understanding is that Matthias Desmet, when he had his book, kind of he exploded. I was like, oh, I recognize what's going on. There's sort of this mass formation of people starting to think very similarly based on the same fear and the same pattern. Anyone who thinks outside of that is somehow an unbeliever or not part of it. And it was just fascinating to watch, but also terrifying, because this was the fabric of our society falling apart all around us in the name of this fear, or this constant fear mongering. So yeah, I mean, it's been a rough go for everybody on this planet. I mean, it's and certainly in this country. And I do think conversation. I mean, thank goodness for the podcasting and alternative meeting ways to meet and communicate and get the word out. And then the idea that I and my colleagues are actually able to make a Hollywood grade production of a very finely tuned docu series. It's going to be multiple episodes featuring. We're like, hey, Clifton Duncan, supremely talented actor. He got drummed out of Broadway, sitting there in Georgia. We're like, hey man, you want to ask a few questions and push back a little bit as a storyteller and an artist? And he was like, yeah, sounds great. It's like fantastic. And that was a conversation we had over and over and over again with many artists, many producers, many filmmakers, and said, why don't we try and tell a story that can lead some of these people, or at least the predominance of our fellow citizens, back to some sort of sense of sanity, so we can talk about this stuff and actually maybe consider the evidence, maybe consider the facts, maybe consider the anecdotal insight of people who are on the ground and having experiences that don't add up to what we're being told from on high. And so it's been a real honor to make this project and to work with Clifton and everybody involved, because we wanted to make sure. I mean, and when we started this, we didn't know how bad we'd be pushed back against, but we feel like we're going to hit the market just right when we release it in June. But I mean, we at the very least, we wanted to have our entry into the historical record, that there were those of us who thought differently at the time, and we were capable of capturing it at a high level, so that we want this film to be germane to the public discussion for decades to come, because we did think differently, and it's turning out that we were pretty much we were right. We were on point. We could see what was happening. We were above target. We were on the pulse, and that's what the show represents. And I hope, Lou, I hope you enjoy seeing it when you see it. And yeah, it's coming out in June, so it's been a journey, because that's what we're trying to reflect what we all went through.
Yeah, no, I really hope. I hope nothing but great things for this. I guess what I fear is sort of the mentality that we have now, like as a society, where it's sort of like, oh, okay, I'm moving on. There's something else. I got to move on. It's sort of like similar to what happened over those years. Clifton, you brought it up, where it was like, okay, we got this global pandemic. And now we need to end systemic racism. So everyone take to the streets. And also we got to get Trump out of here. And it's sort of like, well, hold on a second. Can we focus on, one thing at a time,
Well, I mean, I don't know, because I definitely share that fear in some capacity. I mean, I've blocked a few people who, whenever I mentioned what happened to me, they say, you're still on that. And
Right.
it's like, well, yes, asshole, I am. But at the same time, at least, I'm looking at the reaction on Twitter to people like Randy Weingarten, for instance, who, for people who don't know, I think she's the head of the American Federation of Teachers, a teachers union in the United States. And she was instrumental in keeping schools closed. As a matter of fact, if I recall correctly, the unions were working, under the table with the CDC to keep the schools closed. I mean, there's reporting out there about that, and it's hilarious because going back to the beginning of the conversation, the sort of revisionism that's taking place with these people. I mean, Randy, she keeps tweeting out about I didn't try to get schools closed, and Republicans were lying, but every one of her tweets gets ratioed. By the way, I mean, she always turns off her comments, so you can't really reply directly to her, but every one of her tweets is getting ratioed, via quote tweets. And now there's this great feature on Twitter called community notes. And so people can actually fact check these tweets in real time. She keeps trying to say, I didn't say this, I didn't do this, but the community notes and keep coming back and saying, no, bitch, you lying. And then, pushback against people like Anthony Fauci, I feel like is also growing. People can see, just he himself, he can't even keep his lies straight. I mean, he's such a bad liar, similar to Bill Gates, where he's talking about, I was misled, I think, by this. I'm like, so wait, I thought you are the science. So did you mislead yourself? What are you talking about? And I think people are beginning to push back more. I think maybe the fog is lifting a little bit. You see mainstream news outlets are finally reporting on things like natural immunity. They're finally reporting on, there was an article about tinnitus after COVID vaccination, and they're trying to say like, oh well, we don't know if it's caused by that, but they're talking more openly about side effects. They're talking more openly about the impacts of school closures right now. In some ways, they're still lying. I mean, there was an article the other day in the New York Times where they said that Black unemployment among New Yorkers, the employment gap between Blacks and whites in New York is greater than it's been in however many years. And I'm like, well, what they fail to mention is that, again, they imposed these mandates, which threw people out of work and kept them from work. And I see people talking about that and saying, well, why aren't you talking about these mandates that you imposed? So, I think there is a sort of groundswell, and people are, the conversation is shifting. I mean, I mentioned this to Hawk, that it's actually kind of great that this is being released, that Follow the Science is being released right now, because it seems like the environment is sort of, the ice is kind of thawed right now, and people are going to be, I think, more open and receptive to really understanding, I want to say what went wrong, but that implies mistakes were made, and that kind of thing I think lets some people off the hook. But so yeah, there are those people who are going to try and pretend that nothing untoward ever happened, and they're going to convince themselves that everything we did was meant to save lives. But I think there's a growing contingent of people who are also saying, no, that's bullshit, and we need accountability, and we don't want atonement. We need to talk about what happened and the harms that have been done.
And
yeah.
and I was just going to say, Hawk, too, and I think it also helps when you have a group of people who stood up against the tide, and were asking the right questions for them, however many years later, to be vindicated. And it's like, no, we're going to take a fucking victory lap, and we're going to remind you of what you did. And you brought up Randy Weingarten. My friend Corey DeAngelis is amazing with her, because he goes at her with receipts, just receipt after receipt after receipt. It's like, no, this chick was just trying to keep schools closed for as long as possible. So I feel like being right on some things, I think, is also an energizing force. I mean,
and taking stock of, I mean, what the show does and what needs to be done, generally speaking, is like, we have to understand what we got right, what we got wrong, where we got lucky, and then in terms of the historical understanding of it, really understanding what we got wrong so we don't repeat it again. Because I mean, this was a historically significant time then, and we watched our leaders flounder, even though they presented it as a noble lie. Like, we're like, hey, we need to get people to do stuff, so we're going to bend the truth to what we need it to be. And they, at this point, I don't think any of them really had any idea what was going on. And there was just some sort of, there was all this talk about like the science presented, like Fauci was like, well, the science now says this, and yet he would never point to anything other than things he specifically paid for. Usually around that month, he'd pay for something, it'd get, he'd say, hey, show me this, and he'd report on it. And it was like, there was never like a deep understanding of where this scientific consensus was coming from, and this sort of wandering messaging. It was just so outrageous, and yet he had total carte blanche to kind of sit there with a straight face and try and tell people that he had the best interest of the citizenry at heart. And I don't believe he did. I think it was, I mean, there are people who certainly should be out of office for what has happened, and I do believe eventually there are those who should be criminally charged for this, and for things that happen to people. It's, I mean, we talk about the disgraced governor of New York, who was allowed to leave in disgrace for social reasons, shall we say, rather than for his choice
for being Italian.
Being Italian,
being
that's
Italian,
right.
using
that's
his
right.
hands.
Where's his papers, sir? Yeah,
that's right.
But yeah, no, it's just crazy that it's like people like that were let off the hook. I mean, there were a lot of senior citizens in the New York area who died needlessly because of policies that he hid and knew were wrong, and he'd rather hide them for political reasons rather than try and help people. I mean, I guess maybe I'm naive, where I still like to think that we generally want to help our fellow humans. And I don't know. I'd like to see us get back to some sort of kumbaya moment, but I don't know. I'm just going to make films and try and help people understand what happened.
Well, I think on that note, guys, thank you so much for being here. We're actually going to go over to my locals, thelouperez.locals.com, for an exclusive with Hawk and Clifton. In the meantime, please go over to followthescienceseries.com, and I can't wait for it to drop. It's going to be great. Hawk, I know you're working on this. You got to get it out. Awesome. Clifton, how about yourself? Any other projects? Anything you want to plug?
Well, I just started a new newsletter. It's called The State of the Arts. It's a saucy commentary that lives at the nexus of art, entertainment, culture, and society. Just like my podcast, the Clifton Duncan podcast, which I made easy to remember, and you can find that on my YouTube channel, which is Clifton Duncan. So I'm easy to find, and you can hit me up on Twitter at Clifton A Duncan. So I'm trying to build the podcast and trying to build the newsletter, and working on other projects as well. So we'll see what happens. Just stay tuned.
Awesome. And I'll just quickly throw in that Follow the Science was 100% grassroots supported. We raised over $500,000 from our support base. And to your viewers, Lou, I mean, if they want to, we're still looking to finish up the project. We're paying for our final round of vending and our vendors, and to get it just awesome for our June release. And then we'll be going on to make the series. So if anyone's interested in supporting us, we greatly appreciate it. And we couldn't do it with our supporters. So happy to get more people on the roster and keep them informed as to what Follow the Science is up to.
Awesome. We're going to end the broadcast.